Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 231 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris, and we are here to wish you a very happy National Poetry Month.
Woohoo! This is the first episode in April. April is National Poetry Month, one of our favorite months of the year.
It's such an appropriate month, isn't it, for poetry? April, when things are budding out of the ground, at least here on the Western Hemisphere.
Indeed.
Northern Hemisphere, wherever we are.
Where the hell are we?
Yes. So, I mean, we do think every day is National Poetry Day. And we had a fantastic conversation earlier today with poet and anthologist James Cruz about all of his poetry and his anthologies. But he has a new one coming out that he co-edited with his husband, Brad Peacock. Love is for All of Us, Poems of Tenderness and Belonging from the LGBTQ plus community and friends.
And we just spent time with James on video. It's up on BookTube. We'll put a link in the show notes. He read poetry. We read poetry. He talked to us about how he became a poet. It was really fun and really special for us, and we hope you'll give it a watch. And subscribe to our BookTube channel whilst you're there, and then you'll get updates when we put new videos up.
Yeah, we tend to put up a video every Friday. That is us, sometimes with a guest. And then we do put our episodes up there every other Tuesday. They are just audio, but they are there. Some listeners requested that we do that because that's how they consume their podcast, is on YouTube. So you can listen to us there. And then you can also see us there on Fridays.
So we also have a patron to thank.
Yes. Welcome, Sue. Sue is our newest patron.
And we're so happy to have you. Thanks for giving us support. We really appreciate it.
Yes, we do. Now, I have a correction to make from the last episode. We were talking about the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. And I had said, oh, they have the Emily Dickinson Center there. And I misspoke a little bit. I did double check that. And the Emily Dickinson Center is at the Houghton Library, also at Harvard. Harvard has dozens of libraries. And these two in particular are very important libraries. I mean, every library is important. Every little free library is important, right? But these are big, powerful libraries that support a lot of research and students. And they're both at Harvard.
Thank you for letting us know.
Yes, we have to, make sure people go to the right place to see Emily Dickinson's desk.
That's right.
I mean, they're only a half a mile away from each other. I did a Google Map thing just to see how close they were. So when we go up there next time, we'll have to do a walkabout.
Yes, for sure. I love Harvard's campus. I've only been there once, but it's very beautiful.
It is. It's fun to walk around.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge, as most major universities are. We also had a wonderful email from listener Julie, who told us about an ongoing biblio adventure that she's been doing since November. I'll read this part. I'm a member of the University of Washington's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which is a program for people over 50 that offers in-person and online non-credit classes, lectures, study groups, etc. She says there are Osher groups affiliated with colleges and universities across the U.S. Anyway, last fall, another OSHA member offered a study group focusing on the best American short stories 2024, and I joined. We read a story every week and met in person every Wednesday afternoon for 90 minutes to discuss that week's story. I haven't always liked the stories, but I love the discussions. Through my participation, I've come to really appreciate short stories much more than I did before.
So cool. Thanks for letting us know about that, Julie.
Yeah, thank you. And I just think it's such a great example of lifelong learning and diving into a genre or a literary form that you maybe don't, as she said, she has not always appreciated that, but, immersing yourself in a form can really help you appreciate it more.
And especially when you do it with others, as we talk about with our read-alongs and when we do buddy reads, it just elevates your reading experience.
Absolutely.
So I'm so glad that was offered and she took him up on it.
So, Emily, what are you currently reading?
I am reading a book that I picked up when I was in Colorado visiting my son and my daughter-in-law and baby Bo. And I got a minute to run over to White River Books in Carbondale, Colorado, which I love. And this book, I bought it for the cover. I admit it. It's called Swim Home to the Vanished by Brendan Shea Basham. And so far it's about grief. Damien has lost his brother. He's a chef. And the opening scene, he's smoking fish in an oven, smoking trout, and thinking about his brother. And he reaches back behind his ear and he discovers he's growing gills. And suddenly he's drawn towards the water, and he's in Colorado, and he starts to take a trek to Seattle, to the Pacific. And I'm at the point in the novel where he's come to this village, and when he enters the village, there's a funeral going on there. So he enters into another world of grief. And it's written in a very unusual way. So I decided to download the audiobook, which is narrated by Sean Taylor Corbett. And I feel like it did kind of help me get the voice of the novel a little bit more. So I'll probably continue by going back and forth with the hard copy and the audiobook. Again, it's called Swim Home to the Vanished by Brendan Shea Basham. And I guess I should describe the cover since I said I bought it for the cover. It's 3 metallic silver fish skeletons on the cover. Very compelling.
Well, the word swim is in the title too. That probably...
Of course, drew me. She knows me well.
I am reading a math book, believe it or not. I know, right? But I tricked you. It's actually about Shakespeare. It is called Much Ado About Numbers, Shakespeare's Mathematical Life and Times. This is by Rob Eastaway. And it is so adorable. The cover has a image of Shakespeare on it, but it's all made up of numbers. So like there's 26 around his eyes, if you could see that, like when you really look at it. I saw it at the library and I had to pick it up and see what was going on about this book. And it is written by a math teacher, and each year he goes to the British Mathematical Association conference. And the year 2022, they held it in William Shakespeare's hometown, Stratford-upon-Avon, right? And each year, Rob and his friend, Andrew Jeffrey is his name, they do a workshop at this teacher conference where they find lighthearted, pick and mix mathematical curiosities that they present to people. So I'm going to read you a paragraph or two. This is from the prologue. But the location caught my imagination. Following the old rule that you're more creative if you put a constraint on yourself, I suggested that we theme our workshop on Shakespeare. Why not pick out Shakespearean quotes and link them to mathematical concepts? We could do a slot about the use of zero and call it Much Ado About Nothing. Another one about fractions called Henry V, a.k.a. Henry the 20%. And dotted throughout, there could be a comedy of math errors. Cheesy, yes, but we knew our audience. The curious thing was, however, was that the more I hunted for superficial links between Shakespeare and mathematics, the more I realized that Shakespeare's world was filled with much deeper mathematical ideas, and that many of them are reflected in his plays. I'll stop reading there, but I just thought this is such a charming prologue and a great idea for combining math and Shakespeare. One thing I really love and the other thing I'm afraid of. So this was published in 2024. And again, that's Much Ado About Numbers, Shakespeare's Mathematical Life and Times by Rob Eastaway. It is a smaller format hardcover book that would make a really nice graduation gift.
Very cool. Well, I had a day the other day where I needed to cook all day. And so I went deep into my audiobook library and found this book that I've been wanting to read for a long time and spent the day with it. I'm still not done. I'm partway through. Storyworthy: Engage, Teach, Persuade, and Change Your Life Through the Power of Storytelling. And this is by Matthew Dix. Some of you might recognize his name. He was a Booktopia author. I first met him at Booktopia Santa Cruz, but I know he has also attended Booktopias in Northshire in Vermont. He is a Connecticut author, and he narrates the audiobook. But as I was listening to it, there were certain passages I knew I wanted to be able to take notes on and read and kind of see how he was presenting it in the book. So when I got a break from cooking, I quickly ran to our library and picked up a copy as well. He has written 4 novels, and this, I believe, is his first work of nonfiction. And Matthew has won a lot of Moth Story Slams. He's also won their Grand Slam, which is like the highest slam you can win. And in the beginning of this book, he talks about not really wanting to do a Moth Story Slam, but someone, I don't think they dared him, but they really encouraged him. And so the way the story slams work is you put your name in a hat or a bag or whatever they happen to have on the stage at the time. And sometimes your name is drawn and sometimes it's not. So he spends time at the first one like hoping that his name isn't drawn. It is drawn. He tells a story. He wins. He falls in love with being a storyteller. And this is his book that talks about how to tell a good story. It's really well done. One of the things that he clarifies in the very beginning chapter, which is called What is a Story, is, I'm just going to read this. He says, "Let's also be clear that when I talk about storytelling, I am speaking about personal narrative, true stories told by the people who lived them. This is very different than the traditional fable or folk tale that many people associate with the word storytelling. While folk tales and fables are entertaining and can teach us about universal truths and important life lessons, there is power in personal storytelling that folk tales and fables will never possess." Which is true. I think of folk tales and fables also as often being moral, whereas storytelling here is, you're learning a little bit about a person or a fun fact about something that happened in their life. I'm really enjoying it. He has little breaks that are storytelling breaks. So he'll tell some of his stories. Once he's explained to you how to do certain things, he'll break it down in how he told the story, or you hear it then in the story that he's sharing. He and his wife, Alicia, also started Speak Up, which is a storytelling organization in Connecticut. And we've attended some of those events. Mm-hmm. And one of the purposes of that is that often people who take his workshop are encouraged to be a new storyteller on the stage. And they're not always, like professional storytellers, which is really fun. He has a YouTube channel also where he has kind of like a storytelling academy with a bunch of videos. So I'll post a link to that in the show notes. Really enjoying it. Highly recommend. I think learning to tell a story, as he says, is helpful even for telling a story around the dinner table. It's not as if you need to read this book and then go get on a stage and win a Moth Story Slam. Again, it's called Storyworthy, Engage, Teach, Persuade, and Change Your Life Through the Power of Storytelling by Matthew Dix.
Nice. Yeah, my wife Laura took a workshop with him. She used to do live lit. It's called Live Lit in Chicago. A lot of bookstores and other places held events where people would tell stories. It's fascinating to hear people's stories. And also kind of troubling sometimes when people aren't ready yet emotionally to tell certain stories.
Oh, yeah, I imagine.
Yeah, because I was at one that really went off the rails, so
wow.
It's great to have mentors to help you with that.
Yeah, and he gives examples of this is what you don't want to do. And I can't stand when people do this, and things like that. And then when he puts it in context, you hear it. Like, oh yeah, that would get grating if someone did that. And he talks about, because he's a teacher, that there's a thing he allows his students to tell. I can't remember what it's called. It's like One Sentence Monday or something. When they come in after the weekend, all of his students want to tell him a story about the weekend. And he said time doesn't really allow that, but also they're terrible storytellers sometimes.
They're grade school kids, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, he's a grade school teacher.
So he's kind of teaching them how to be storytellers by saying, you can give me one sentence.
Yeah.
And sometimes he said the sentence is so compelling that you might be encouraged to ask follow-on questions. But lots of times it's like, okay, thanks for that sentence about, your soccer game. Good to know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I just want to clarify, the moth events we've been to have been all really excellent. And I haven't been to like the big one in New York. Have you?
I haven't. No. I mean, they do grand slams now all over. I know where Aunt Ellen's living, they have a moth slam in Berkeley, but then they have a grand slam in San Francisco in the big city. So they have them all over now. We have them close by, I know, in Boston and in New York. So I would love to go to one. When I visited Ellen, I went to the one in Berkeley, and it was so much fun.
Nice.
And it really is interesting to see. Some people are obviously more practiced than others, or some people you just get nerves getting up on the stage and your story kind of leaves you.
Or I remember Matthew talking one time, maybe it was at Booktopia or something. He was talking about how sometimes the audience is just like blank. Like it's so much of storytelling, at least at his level, is kind of reading the audience, and vibing off of the audience, just like live theater in general,
Right.
like you vibe off the audience. But that if things are just not working, if it's a hard audience, like you could really start shaking in your boots,
Yeah, especially if you're trying to get them to laugh or something and there's no reaction. That must be the worst. I mean, it's just like comedians saying when they bomb, Ugh.
Yeah.
Now I'm getting sweaty and nervous just thinking about it.
That's why you and we like to read books.
That's right.
Well, okay, so speaking of books, I'm not reading a book. The other thing I wanted to mention was a magazine that I love, Fine Books and Collections. I've been a subscriber for quite a long time, and I brought this issue to the table today. It's spring 2025, because I have an article here on the renovated Frick. Last episode, Emily talked about the Frick Museum, and this article is about the Frick Library. That is part of the museum, which is one of the most well-used art research museums. So like the library room itself, the reading room hasn't really changed because it's a historic landmark and they don't want to change things like that. They clean the walls and everything, so everything is much brighter. But they do have an additional expanded digital lab, a new conservation studio, and a new research consultancy room. And they're thinking about opening those up like once a month for a tour for the public to see, which is amazing. I mean, you can find some of those types of labs on YouTube channels sometimes, and you can see a conservationist working on a piece, which I think is fascinating. And then the museum renovation now, the second floor is opened up and it hadn't been before, so they have more display space. But there's also a new education center and a 220-seat circular auditorium. So I was thinking like we should put them on our event radar because there might be some really cool talks or presentations we could go see.
That's a very cool synchronicity.
Isn't it?
I remember when Fiona was writing the novel that took place there and the Frick was closed, that she said they have really good online resources and they had some digital exhibits so she could get the feel of the layout of the museum when she was writing the story.
Yes.
She must be so excited that it's reopened.
Well, and one of the things it said is that like before, you'd have to leave the museum and walk outside to get to the library. And now everything is internal. You don't have to leave. And also, I don't remember what percentage, but a good percentage of items held at the Frick are absolutely unique items. So that is spurring on the effort to digitize things so that more people will have access to these rare pieces. And now that I say all of this, I'm wondering, did we talk about Fiona Davis's book about the Frick on YouTube or on the episode?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, I read it.
Yeah.
So I'm sure I talked about it on the episode at some point.
Okay. We'll find a link and put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was really cool. Another synchronicity is they have an article about one of the Irish museums in New York City. This is a great magazine. A lot of people think it's just for like serious book collectors, and it is for those types of people, but they have so much literary history in here and just cool things about books. Really exciting magazine, Fine Books and Collections.
And the reason Chris said synchronicity about the Irish writers is because that was what we spoke about with our patrons during the reading salon in March, which was so much fun.
That was a great conversation. And coming up for our April Patreon salon, we will be talking about poetry and sharing some of our favorite poems and poets and Everything poetry.
Yes. Chris, what did you just read?
I finished Swan's Way.
Woohoo!
Yes.
That's why she's walking around with a lighter step.
A little bit of cockiness, you know. Yeah, so by Proust, that was the first volume of In Search of Lost Time. I'm so happy to have finished it. It was a struggle at times, but not at other times. I'm so happy I read it with a group of people. This is a group of readers that Robin from Sacramento got together, and we had a wonderful final conversation about it. I've talked about this book for several episodes now, so I won't really talk a ton right now, but I will say, in follow-up to me saying that I would give people some stats about this whole shebang, it is 7 volumes long. It is a total of 4,215 pages, or 1.2 million words.
Oh my gracious.
It is a lot. He published this between 1913 and 1927. And the editions that we're reading are, so it's 7 editions. It's a new English translation of the whole In Search of Lost Time. But each volume is translated by a different translator.
Interesting.
Yes, because it took them something like 5-8 years or so, maybe even up to 10 to translate one volume. I mean, you'd have to take your entire career to translate it, to have one translator. I mean, to do a thorough job, right? So by getting together these 7 different translators, like what a great idea. And I'm so curious now about what feel the different volumes might have because of that. So yeah, Swan's Way, under my belt.
Way to go. Congratulations.
Yeah, that was a tough one. I think it was harder than James Joyce's Ulysses for me. Colleen and I talked a bit about that, just about like there's so much irreverence in Joyce. And it's just so all over the place with different scenes and different styles that you get a different experience with each chapter. Whereas with Swan's Way, it's very consistent. I mean, you might be in Cambria with the young narrator, and then you're in Paris with Swan, who's an older man pursuing this younger woman, but it's all the same style. Very long sentences.
I did not read Swan's Way.
But don't you feel like it? I mean, you've heard enough about it.
No, actually I don't, but I'm relieved. Every time you've talked about it, I'm like, I'm so glad you read these books and I get to hear about it and I don't read them. But whilst you were reading that, I finished Care and Feeding, a memoir by Lori Willever. She is someone who spent a lot of her career working for difficult men. That's where the title comes from, because one of her friends at some point said to her something about that and how she spent a lot of time caring for and feeding people. And she thought it would make a good title for the memoir. And it starts out in the early 90s, and she's living in New York City in a really gross apartment. She's trying to make a way for herself, and she has a job she doesn't like, and she decides to go to culinary school. And not because she really wants to work in kitchens so much, but because she wants to write about food. And she thinks that it'll give her more gravitas if she's gone to culinary school.
That's amazing.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
She makes a point of saying, it was the early 90s and it was different. Culinary school was different then than it is now. And just the whole world of restaurants and cooking was much different, mostly populated by these brash men. And so she goes to culinary school, but then she's not looking for jobs the way her fellow classmates are looking for jobs. She has had people say, no matter what you want to do, you need to go work in a kitchen for 6 months or no one's going to take you seriously. She started to do private chef cooking, working in people's kitchens, cooking meals for them and their family. And then her school said, we've gotten this job posting for Mario Batali. He's looking for an assistant. This was just when his career was taking off. He had the restaurant Babbo. She was the only person that applied for the job. She got the job. And because of the success of Babbo, he was asked to write a cookbook. And so she steps in, and right away he's like, eat everything on the menu, get to know what's happening here. And then she started to write down the recipes and help him work for the cookbook. Right away, he is somewhat sexually inappropriate with her, grabbing her ass. But she's like, confronts him right away and says, do not ever do that again. and made it clear what her expectations were for their relationship. But she did witness him being forceful and inappropriate in other ways throughout her 4 years working for him. And then when she announces she's going to leave and she gives him a year notice because she wants to leave on good terms, he recommends her to Anthony Bourdain, or how she refers to him, Tony Bourdain. And she is interviewed by him, and he hires her to help him with a couple cookbooks. And as she's telling stories about herself, she's also sharing that she is very much addicted to alcohol and smoking pot and occasionally pills. And even though she's not living the life of someone cooking in restaurants, she is definitely living what is commonly the life of stressed out people using a lot of drugs to make their way through life that you often see in restaurants. Fast forward several years where she's been doing some writing now, not only of cookbooks, but writing some under her own pen name for New York Times and Eater magazine and some other things. She's also worked as an editor for Wine Spectator magazine. She did traveling for Mario Batali. She's also traveling for this job as an editor with Wine Spectator. Tony Bourdain's looking for a new assistant and hires her. And she becomes his assistant and was working for him for 9 years up until the time of his suicide. So she writes a lot about that. She also writes about her continued use of alcohol and marijuana in particular. It gets a little tiresome to read, I have to say, partly because I do not enjoy reading stuff like that. I've read some reviews that talk about how people might judge her a little bit more harshly because she also gets married and has a child and is still very much imbibing in all of these things. And I had to check myself, like, are you judging her more harshly because she's a mother? I don't think so. I was like, I don't understand how you're functioning and how you are able to write and do all of these things. I'm someone who stands up and raises her hand and says, life is hard. Every day is a challenge. I don't know how people do it completely inebriated or high all day. I honestly can't wrap my head around that. She hits a wall and decides that she's an alcoholic and needs help and starts with AA meetings and the 12 steps of recovery, and is a recovered alcoholic now and has been, I think, 6 or 7 years sober. So then she's writing this memoir on the other side of all those experiences, which I think is really interesting also. Part of what this book is really about is the Me Too movement and these men who had to come to terms with how they were treating people. Mario Batali's career completely tanked. Tony Bourdain did not have seemingly anything like this, but at the time of his death was dating somebody who had been assaulted by Weinstein. Mm-hmm. And so Tony Bourdain was involved in her pursuit of reckoning and talked to Lori about her own experiences with Mario Batali and encouraged her to come forward with what she knew. Mm. And she had very mixed feelings about whether or not she should do that, which she also talks about in this memoir. The part of this book that did work for me that I really learned a lot and appreciated was that as Lori is working for Mario Batali and Tony Bourdain and as the editor of Wine Spectator at some point, she really is trying to build her career as a writer. Remember, that's how it started out. You know, I want to go to culinary school. I want to be a writer. And so she really has accomplished that and didn't just do it under the thumb of these important, you know, famous men. She got her start that way, and she has co-authored many books, including Tony Bourdain, An Oral History. That is the book that came out after talking about Tony Bourdain and sharing his stories about his life after he died by suicide. And when she writes about food itself in this book, I really enjoyed it. She did have times in her life where she was cooking for people or was asked to do a special event or a party. There were times where she was eating fantastic food in Tokyo with Tony Bourdain. I really did enjoy that and enjoyed her writing. The part that was difficult to take was all of the substance abuse, which was relentless, daily, hourly substance abuse for most of the book until the very end when she goes into AA.
Yeah, it's amazing what the human body tolerate. Yeah. And people could still be walking around looking like they're functioning.
Yes, exactly.
That was good. I'm glad you brought that back to her writing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because it was really about her. And also, like, that's the whole point, is she has a career, you know, and it isn't just about these men. I'm glad I read it. It was an uncomfortable read for me. And I also did listen to the audiobook, which she narrates. Again, it's called Care and Feeding, a memoir by Lori Willever.
Nice. What was the audio experience like? I know sometimes it can be a little challenging when the author reads their own work.
I thought she did a really good job. I was thinking about how, of course, she wrote it, so I'm sure by the time she's reading the audiobook, she's a little removed from the experience, maybe. You know how some authors say they read their work aloud? I wonder what it is like to read aloud these intensely mired experiences she had with her own addiction. Mm-hmm. You know? Yeah. It was a tough read, I have to say.
Yeah. It's a beautiful cover.
Yeah, it is a beautiful cover.
Well, after I finished Proust, I was looking for something completely different, and I found the perfect thing. The Stolen Queen by Fiona Davis. This is her latest novel. I wanted something that I knew would be a good story without completely stressing me out, and that would end well. You know?
Yes, I do know.
Yeah. So Fiona is known for writing dual narrative type novels, and we've talked before about some of hers, like the one Emily and I were just talking about that is set around the Frick Museum in New York City. She's written one called The Masterpiece that was set around Grand Central Terminal. And then We Love the Lions of Fifth Avenue, which is about the library, or set around the library. The Stolen Queen is set around the Met, and particularly their Egyptology area. The main protagonist is a woman named Charlotte Cross, who is, I think, about 60, in her 60s or so. She's an Egyptologist. She's like the associate curator for the department. And you find out her background pretty early on. In 1936, she was in Egypt. She wasn't an Egyptologist. She was wanting to be one. So she was there doing things like, you know, taking the notes of items that were being uncovered and things like that. So you have that kind of dual storyline. It doesn't exactly go like back and forth. Like, it's not a clean back and forth, but you get some of her backstory and what's going on with her at the Met now. And that is set in the 1970s, 1978 to be precise. The other character is called Annie Jenkins, and she's an 18-year-old who is really into fashion and has a mother who is, you know, alcoholic, emotionally dysfunctional, you know, pretty much everything dysfunctional. She's a model who is aging out of a lot of opportunities, apparently going from man to man kind of situation, has no time, emotionally incapable of taking care of a daughter. And so Annie ends up running something over to the Met for a gala. And there's a woman, oh gosh, what is her name? Deanna Veerland. She was like a famous fashionista type woman. She's putting on this gala at the Met that they do every year. And so Annie runs over a boa from her landlord for a display that they're doing. It doesn't work out. But she runs into Charlotte. So Charlotte and Annie kind of start having this connection. I just really enjoy Fiona's stories because I feel like they're a little bit suspense. They're a little bit mystery. They're always women who are fighting against the patriarchy. There's always some dismissive jerk in the story. And then just the system against women. Like, here she is, an Egyptologist who has 40 years of experience, right? She's at the Met. She's the one doing all the work, and her boss is taking all the credit. But she's working, you know, and she's doing the job. So I really appreciate seeing older women in literature the older I get. So thank you, Fiona, for having an older protagonist.
Fiona's also a journalist. So she does a tremendous amount of research, which I feel like make her books really come alive.
Yeah, and there are scenes set in Egypt later in the 70s because Charlotte goes back to Egypt. She hadn't been there for a very long time because when she was there as a young woman, she discovered a tomb and they discovered something within the tomb, and she feels like she was cursed. So she has not been back to Egypt. She had tried to go back a couple times before and things didn't pan out. But she is back in Egypt as her 60-year-old self in the 1970s on the trail of something. So I will leave it at that. Now, Fiona gets knocked every now and then for having leaps that happen, or in this case, somebody trips and falls too many times. I don't care. It's a good story. Mm-hmm. It doesn't bother me in the least.
Yeah. Write your own book.
Well, that's kind of how I feel about it, because I think they're good stories and enjoy the story.
Don't be looking for stuff. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody has their preferences on what they like to read. Mm-hmm. And I just enjoy Fiona's book. So again, everyone, that was The Stolen Queen by Fiona Davis, out now.
Well, I also finished The Cliffs by J. Courtney Sullivan. I talked about currently reading this book in the last episode, and this is the one that led you to the correction, because the protagonist in this story is Jane, who is a Harvard archivist. I've been reading it for a while because we had some other reading assignments that we needed to get done, and I also started listening and reading this memoir. Sadly, there is a thread in this novel about someone being an alcoholic. And it is Jane, the protagonist, and she comes from a long line of people who struggle with alcoholism. And I appreciated that part of the novel because it is about self-sabotage and how we end up sometimes at a place in our lives because of struggles and addictions that we have. It got a little tiresome. It went on a little too long, I felt like. Could have used a little bit of editing. It's a very long book, almost 400 pages. I ended up really enjoying the novel. One of the threads is about epigenetics, which we've talked about in the past. Studies are showing now that there are actual changes in our DNA because of experiences that people ahead of us have had. And these are influenced by environmental things. And what people often talk about with this is trauma. Your family members in past history have had trauma, and it's literally embedded in your DNA over the course of history. Well, this book raises the question, is it a leap to imagine that trauma might infect the land on which things happened? Was that a form of haunting all of its own? This is a ghost story. There are ghosts in here, and they are residing at a house that is built on land where indigenous people had stories to tell as well. And there's some unearthing of graves that happens. There's deaths that happen on that land. And that's the part of the novel that really took off for me and that I really enjoyed. So I'm really glad I read it. She touches on the Shakers, which I didn't know much about. So that took me out of the novel to read some history on the Shakers. And there's mediums in the novel, which I know when we're talking about ghost stories, ironically, that might have come up in our short story that we're going to talk about here soon. So I really enjoyed it, and it was a fun ghost story to read for the ghost story bingo card. And I would recommend this book. The only hesitation I have is the sections where there's a lot of drinking. It bogged down the story a little bit for me. I think that could have been handled a little bit more quickly, but maybe, the story had to devolve for it to grow again.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Again, that's called The Cliffs by J. Courtney Sullivan.
All right. Well, Emily mentioned our short story for this episode. It is Mary Elizabeth Braddon, The Cold Embrace.
Dun, 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 dun. It just seems like it needs that with that title.
I know. The Cold Embrace.
This was a really short story. It was, I believe, 10 pages.
Yeah.
It was a quick read. I listened to it first and then I went to read it and enjoyed the reading experience more than the listening experience.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Really? Why? Tell me.
I just felt like I got it a little bit more. I think part of it was even the first two sentences. He was an artist, dash. Such things as happen to him happen sometimes to artists. He was a German, dash. Such things as happen to him happen sometimes to Germans. Kind of set the tone, I think, for who he was. The next sentence, he was young, handsome, studious, enthusiastic, metaphysical, reckless, unbelieving, heartless. I don't know. I just liked the pace of the reading more than the listening in this one.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could see that.
even though I just read it to y'all. So you just had the audiobook experience.
Well, this one was published in 1860. So if you don't have the book, we're reading from the Penguin Book of Ghost Stories from Elizabeth Gaskell to Ambrose Bierce. You could probably get it on Project Gutenberg or find it some other place if you'd like to experience the written word.
It is in Project Gutenberg, and in the show notes, just so you all know, I have been putting the free version so you could click on that link and read it yourself if you'd like.
Yeah.
Print it out, whatever you want to do.
So what do you think about the story in general? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways?
Up for me.
Thumbs up, okay.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I was leaning towards thumbs down on this one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I thought this one had super creep factor.
Really?
Yes.
What was creepy for you?
Well, so I guess, we don't want to give too many spoilers, I guess.
True.
This is only a 10-page short story, so it'd be really easy to give it away.
Yeah, it would.
I think what's creepy for me about this story is when reading about ghosts and why ghosts come to be, a lot of it is because they have unfinished business. Mm-hmm. And this is a story about two people who fall in love. It's Wilhelm and Gertrude. And Wilhelm gives Gertrude a ring, a gold serpent ring that she wears on her finger, and it's to signify that they are betrothed to each other. They're madly in love. Wilhelm is an artist. He gets sent off to Italy to go paint and decides to fall in love with someone else. Gertrude has some feelings about that and is angry about it. And I guess it's a spoiler to say, but I'm going to spoil it. So fast forward if you don't want to hear this, that she becomes a ghost and haunts him. And I'm like, yeah, girlfriend, you go for it. And it's creepy because she keeps grabbing him from behind. And he knows it's her ghost because when he goes to grab the hands that are holding his chest, he feels the serpent ring.
Yeah, which was his mother's. We are spoiling the hell out of this story.
We are.
Yeah.
Well, we told people to fast forward. When Wilhelm, he falls for a model that, modeled for his painting. And the term was bewitched his fancy. I'm like, fuck you and your fancy, dude. You left Gertrude at home thinking you were coming back.
I know, with your mother's ring.
Yes.
Like you're disloyal to your betrothed and to your mother.
Yeah.
Gross spine.
In 10 pages, I thought that Braddon did so much.
That's true. That's true. I wasn't thinking about the brevity of the story because for me it was, and again, it's 1860, right? So to say it's full of stereotypes, this is at a time when these things were happening. So they're not necessarily stereotypes yet. Some of the things.
So what didn't work for you?
Maybe the brevity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, maybe that's it. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it was too much of a sketch when I wanted more meat. Maybe.
See, and I'm definitely a brevity reader, right? Like, so to me, it was like it had a very fast clip. So what happens, well, we're going to spoil more. So Gertrude is waiting for Wilhelm to come back because her dad decides that she needs to marry this rich suitor and sets her up. And so she doesn't want to get married and she's waiting and she sends him missives, like, would you come home, come save me from this marriage that I don't want to have? And he ignores her. It's not that he's not getting the messages. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm bonking the model now. I'm not really interested in you.
Yeah, so he comes back after what he thinks is the wedding day.
Right.
Thinking he's going to be in the clear with his dog. His dog is with him a lot. There's another dog in a ghost story. So the dog knows what's going on.
Right.
Or knows something is going on when he does come back. And this, okay, we also wanted to talk about an article that Adele sent us. Would this be a good time?
Yes.
To talk about that? So Adele sent us an article.
It's from Atlas Obscura. And we should say Adele is a reference librarian. Thank you for digging this article up for us, Adele. And it's called, Why Are There So Many Female Ghosts? Female ghosts seem to dominate the afterlife. Whether the spirits are real or not, the reasons for the disparity could be revealing. By Nathaniel Sharping. And we will put a link in the show notes to this.
Now, what makes me think about the article at this time is that There are several different reasons brought up in the article about why there are so many female ghosts. And one of them is Edgar Allan Poe's belief that the most beautiful and poetic thing in the world is a dead woman, which it's like, okay, dude, you really needed some help. I don't mean to be dismissive about that, but I mean, that is a really creepy, complicated, loaded thing to say.
Yeah.
That back then and today, in both instances, right? But talking about suicide as well. So you can't think about a beautiful woman being so poetic without thinking about like Romeo and Juliet, right? One of the classic love stories that involves suicide and thinking that that's romantic somehow. And in the story that we read, The Cold Embrace, there is a suicide that happens. And the painter says, so this is the quote, "Suicides are always handsome," says the painter. And then he stands for a while, idly smoking and meditating, looking at the sharp outline of the corpse and the stiff folds of the rough canvas covering. So, I mean, it is a good story, I guess. You know, I mean, it's very compact, though, and maybe I wasn't expecting that. And so I was left feeling like, what?
Yeah.
I mean, I just read it last night, so maybe I haven't digested it enough. But the whole suicide issue and Poe and dead women being something that causes a haunting. There's also a great line in the article. One of the people that was interviewed for it says, "We have an innate sense of justice. We all do. We like to see bad people punished and good people rewarded, however long it takes."
Well, the other thing it talks about is the abused woman and how someone who is abused or cast out by their community, the only way for them to get recompense, I can never say that word, is to become a ghost and like haunt people and look for retribution. And as ghosts, women have a staying power. They have a voice.
Yes.
It says in the article.
Yeah,
Yes.
that was a fascinating point about that. It's also preserving history in a way. Ghost stories preserve history and they give voice to people who haven't had voice, which I thought was a fascinating point in a very short article.
Yes.
So it doesn't go into great detail, but it has a lot of fascinating points like that. And also hearkening back to the Victorian era, which is where these stories we're reading come from, this time period when the point made in the article is that women were so associated with the home at this point, and even, you know, more so as gender roles got solidified into what men and women do. They're so associated with home. So there you have the haunted houses. And then they're also usually the ones cleaning the body when someone died before mortuaries became popular. So there's that direct association with women and death and the home.
Right. They had actual contact with the dead. Yeah. Well, one of the things I thought, I mean, because it also says in this article that in medieval times, ghosts were manifestations of cautionary tales that a woman might return as a ghost. This collection that we have has biographical and explanatory notes in the back. And it talks about how her parents' marriage collapsed, the author Mary Elizabeth Braddon's parents. And I thought, you know, that's probably some of where this story came from, that she'd had very formative, bad experiences on what you think of marriage and love. And that's what this short story portrayed to me.
Yes. And also just how reliant women were back then on men holding their promises and then following through on their word, or that the dad wants to marry her off to somebody who has more money than this poor student.
Right. She was going to be betrothed to someone that she didn't have a say in.
Right.
When I was talking about the cliffs, there is a part where the person that they're interviewing, this person, Heber, says that women also took a more central role in the otherworldly, as with their involvement with the spiritualist movement as mediums. And that's part of what was in that book, The Cliffs.
Yeah, a book is cited in this article, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts by Leanna Renee Heiber. She's one of the co-authors of that book. And I did manage to get a copy through Hoopla, the audio and the ebook. So I'm going to check that out a little bit. I guess having this brief conversation with you has changed my mind about the story. I think it probably was. I just wasn't prepared for such a short story. And I guess maybe it was a little bit predictable. I mean, it was written in 1860 and it is 2025. And I think we've seen this kind of storyline before.
Yeah. I still loved it.
Yeah. That's good. I'm glad.
I love it when a ghost, gives someone their comeuppance.
Yeah.
It cracks me up because it's definitely the difference between me and you as you just finished reading Swan's Way and like deep detail in your reading. And I'm like, a 300-page book was too long for me. That's why I loved a 10-page short story.
That is so funny. Yeah. Well, in the last sentence, I don't want to read the last sentence, but I was just like, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. So she does get her revenge on him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved that part. And I thought, thank you, Adele, because I read both of these together. And I thought that this article about ghosts being female and then to read this short story with a female ghost was just perfect synchronicity.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. And that article did a really nice job of giving some ideas of why women are more likely to be the ghost, or like we've found 2 children.
Yes.
It's come up several times already. So this is our 4th ghost story out of these books.
I guess we should talk about the next one. The next one is by Amelia B. Edwards, and it's called The North Mail.
Yeah, The North Mail. That's what I have here. And this one we will be discussing on episode 232 for the next episode. So if you are reading along with us and want to send in questions or comments about this story, please do so by April 15th.
And it's always up for discussion on our Goodreads thread. So the other book we read was The Many Lives of Anne Frank by Ruth Franklin.
Oh, such an amazing book.
Really good book. And we have a conversation with Ruth at the end of this episode. We were so lucky to get a chance to talk with her.
Yes, we talked about the new book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. We also talked a bit about Shirley Jackson, because she is also the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. So that was really cool to be able to talk with her about both books.
And Ruth has a Substack called Ghost Stories, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. We really recommend that you subscribe.
Yeah. We're going to talk, obviously, more about the book with Ruth. You'll hear that. So we won't go into great detail here right now. But The Many Lives is basically talking about Anne's life. So it is part biography, and it is part exploration of how Anne and her work was used and how she's kind of turned into an icon and a political tool sometimes. And there are a lot of other books right now. I think it's been popular to write books about books. I mean, this is a book about Anne Frank, who most people associate with her diary. So in some ways, it is a book about a book, but it's so different. It's like experimental is one word that's been used, because the first part is about Anne Frank's biography. The second part is about what happens with her diary and how it's used. But then she has these short little chapters sprinkled throughout called interludes. Is that what she calls them? And they give you greater detail into something like the raid that happened on the secret annex and who was involved and how it went down. And then in part 2, there are more of these interludes that give you a sense of how people have been inspired by Anne.
Yeah.
In different ways. Yeah.
So some of our takeaways from reading this, which we share when we're talking with Ruth, is that it was surprising to learn about how Anne Frank had edited her own diary. Chris and I both had misconceptions about the genesis of the diary itself.
Right. I mean, I didn't read this until I was older. I did not read the diary as a child or a young person. But I think I always thought it was a diary that she kept, like a day-to-day diary that was found and then published as is, with maybe some minor editing for spelling and punctuation, right? But it is not that at all. I mean, she really revised it to better portray the situation that they were all in and to make it a more readable book, a more readable story for other people. And
partly because she was an aspiring writer. She was someone, had she lived, there is the question, what would she have written next? Mm-hmm. Which sadly we will never know.
Yeah, and she does have some other writings that she had there in the annex that were recovered. So yeah, we won't know, but she wanted to have her words reach people, and they certainly have. Mm-hmm. And there were also myths about her dad that I had, that he was a big jerk and edited out stuff about himself to make himself look better in the book. And, that's not the case at all.
No.
So I really recommend people actually read the Diary of Anne Frank for themselves, and then read this book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank, because it has completely changed the way I look at that piece of literature and Anne's life.
We also wanted to talk about just how relevant to today it is to read this work by Ruth Franklin.
Yes, it really is. I mean, she goes into detail about trying to get visas, how Jewish people are trying to get visas to different countries to get out of wherever they were, and how impossible that became at times.
Yeah.
There's a quote I'd like to read. This is when Ruth Franklin is writing about speculation. There's that quote by Anne Frank that she still believes in the goodness of people in spite of everything. And would she still believe that had she lived through the Holocaust?
Because that was obviously written before she ended up in a concentration camp.
One of the really fascinating things about this work is that Ruth Franklin takes Anne's words and uses them throughout her narrative. And Anne's words are displayed in italics, so you know that they're Anne's words. And she does that with so many other resources, facts, evidence, that sometimes I'm just blown away by her sentences and her paragraphs, because she incorporates so much, yet it is still so gracefully written and clear that there's never any confusion. You don't feel like you have to go back and say, wait, what was that? Amazing. She's a fantastic writer. So let me read this paragraph again, responding to, would Anne Frank still believe in the goodness of people? To maintain belief in the goodness of humanity when you see the world being gradually turned into a wilderness isn't necessarily a sentimental fantasy. It can be a courageous statement of faith in a potentially better future, a future in which democracy might yet win out again, even as the thunder approaches and millions suffer. For activists who hope to build such a future for their country, that faith isn't an indulgence, it's a necessity. That just speaks so powerfully to our world today.
Yeah. And also, I think by reading that paragraph, you get a sense of Ruth Franklin's writing. It's not academic, it's very accessible. We both highly recommend that you get your hands on a copy of this book. I should also say that I did listen to some of the audiobook, which is narrated by Erin Bennett, and that was a really great way to consume the book as well.
It was, and she did a really great job of, when Anne's words came up on the page, she changed her voice to make herself sound younger and more enthusiastic like Anne was. I thought the voice was a little too young initially, but Emily's like, no, Anne was 14, 15, she was young and
enthusiastic.
Right? And one more thing about Ruth Franklin, she's really involved with the Biographers International organization, which we've mentioned before. I've mentioned I really like their podcast, Bio. There's a video of her talking about reading as a biographer, and she is in conversation with Anne Boyd Rue, who was our guest on episode 57, which seems like a really long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
But for those of you who are maybe newer listeners, Anne Boyd Rue wrote a really fantastic biography of a book, Little Women, where she wrote about the importance of the book through time and how it has impacted and influenced so many people from when it first came out to today. It's Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy, the story of Little Women and why it still matters. So enjoy our conversation with Ruth at the end of this episode. And seriously, get your hands on a copy of this book. Request it at your library. You will be amazed.
Indeed. Chris, did you go on any biblio adventures?
Well, I had one, and that was the Zoom conversation about Proust. Wonderful conversation. I'm so glad to have read it with these people because I wouldn't have finished it on my own. So next year, February, March, we are going to read volume 2, In Search of Lost Time. And the title of that one is In the Shadow of Young Girls and Flower, which I think sounds
oh my gosh,
awful. It sounds so problematic.
I think you're going to have to do letters. What is it? INSJ or whatever the heck it is. In
the Shadow of Young Girls and Flower. That just sounds
That is so bad.
I know. Yeah. So if you were interested, reach out to Robin on Instagram. We'll put her handle in the show notes.
You guys only have 6 years to go.
Well, you know what? It's going to be fun if we carry this on for 7 years. Wouldn't that be cool?
Well, you've got one done.
Well, and you know what? Thanks to Karen, who's on Instagram at Barker for Books, she said that she's read them all. She read the whole shebang.
Of course she has.
Yes, she has. And Karen said that her least favorite of all 7 volumes is Swan's Way, which gave me a lot of hope for a better reading experience as we go forward.
Right on.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, thanks to my librarian friend over there across the table, I attended the All Connecticut Reads conversation with author Monica Wood. Monica Wood is the author of How to Read a Book and some others, but that's the book that she was there to talk with them about. And she was in conversation with Cindy Heiken, who's the Reader's Advisory Librarian in Wallingford. One fun thing that happened, this was a Zoom conversation. My chat with Zoom popped up with a personal chat, and it was our friend Carol, librarian in Connecticut, who said, "Hi, Emily." So it was so fun to feel like I was attending an event with her, even though, we weren't there together. One of the things that Monica Wood did that I thought was so just spot on, she said, "I can't remember a book that I read a month ago, so I'm going to give you a nice summary of my novel," which I was like, thank you. That's lovely. I had remembered her novel because I loved this book so much. So that's how she started. And then she also talked about one of the things that she's found that's cool as an author is that readers provide her, because, we read a book and consume it, and then we have our own impressions of a book. They've provided her with some things about the novel that they gleaned that she didn't even think about when she was writing. And one of the things that someone said to her is that it's about forgiveness of the unforgivable in others and in yourself. And she hadn't really seen that until someone pointed it out. And I thought that was interesting. They talked about giving grace to ourselves and focusing on forgiving others. But again, the importance of forgiving yourself. And part of that is because one of the themes of this novel is, and this isn't a spoiler because it happens at the very beginning, there's 3 characters in the novel. One of them is in prison. One of them is running a book club in the prison, so she comes in and out. And then one of them is a retired gentleman who was a machinist and is now volunteering and doing fix-it stuff at the local bookstore. And the woman is in jail because she killed somebody with her car. And the person she killed was this gentleman, Frank, who's the machinist, wife. And so it is about what happens as these characters come together and collide. I asked a question, how did she come up with the germ of that idea of the story? And she said that she knew someone who had killed an entire family.
Oh, gosh.
In an accident. Not a drunk driving accident, which is what it was in her novel. But that they didn't move on, but figured out a way to stand beside it. And I thought that was such an interesting way of saying it. And so that was kind of the germ of that idea of the story. She also talked about being 71 years old and how she started publishing in her 40s and feels like her writing is getting better as she ages and lives more life, which I thought was a great thing to think about and to talk about. I really enjoyed the conversation. The other thing about the All Connecticut Reads, just like a lot of other states and towns have these, the website has, I think they have 3 runner-up novels, and then they also have books they're reading for young children and for teenagers. So it's a great resource for building your TBR. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that site. And also it was recorded, so I'll put a link in the show notes to the recording so you can watch it if you would like.
Good. I'm so glad you made that.
Yeah. And then the other quick biblio adventure I want to talk about is I went to see a movie with the Gentleman Caller. It's out now in theaters. It's called Penguin Lessons. And I didn't know that it's based on a novel called The Penguin Lessons, What I Learned from a Remarkable Bird by Tom Michel, which was published in 2015. And it is based on a true story of this guy who goes to be a teacher in Argentina in the 70s. There is a political revolution happening at the time. He's working at a boarding school for boys, and the school is shut down temporarily. So he goes on hiatus to Uruguay. And when he's there, there's been an oil spill, and he ends up rescuing a penguin and getting the oil off of the penguin. And the penguin adopts him and won't. He keeps trying to release it back to nature, ends up going to the boarding school with him and teaches everybody valuable lessons.
Wow.
I thought it was going to be a little bit more funny. It's billed as a dramedy, and it stars Steve Coogan. I think that's his name. And so I expected it to be a little bit more funny. It's poignant, but there is some darkness, which I guess is why they call it a dramedy.
Okay.
But it was a perfect rainy day escape. Highly recommend. Again, it's called The Penguin Lessons.
This episode is sponsored by
Time Enough. Time Enough by Lise Main is historical fiction detailing the journey of a family from Isle of Man across an ocean, a continent, and the decades in the early 1900s. In musical prose that probes the strengths and breaking points of family bonds, a mother and her young son are forced to lead their family to Michigan into the clutches of a brother who nearly destroyed them once. Is there time enough to build a future? Check the show notes for information about Time Enough and the author, Lise Main. Chris, do you have any upcoming jaunts?
Well, we have a couple that we're planning to do together. April 9th at 7 p.m. at the Mark Twain House. Amity Gage is going to be in conversation with Amy Bloom.
Yeah, that's about her novel Heartwood, which I really enjoyed.
And then April 16th at 6 p.m., Maura Casey is going to be discussing her new memoir, Saving Ellen, and that will be at Bank Square Books, their new location.
In Mystic, Connecticut.
It's going to be our first time at an event at the new location. I mean, it's new ownership, too, we should say. So looking forward to that very much. We just talked with Maura Casey on our BookTube channel. Check out that conversation. It was so much fun to get to meet her and talk with her a little bit. She showed off a very cool typewriter that was in service during World War I and World War II. Love that.
We'll put a link in the show notes, but you can also go to our BookTube channel.
And then April 30th, we're going to be heading to New York City, where we will connect with Aunt Ellen, who will be back on the East Coast visiting, to see selected shorts, classics with a twist, at Symphony Space. Yes,
I'm really looking forward to that. And on April 12th, I'm going to be in the city. Sadly, Ellen won't be there. Cherry Bomb is having their Jubilee. And Cherry Bomb is a media company that focuses on women in food and drink space. And this is one of their big events. And they have a lot of cookbook authors there. And I'm going to be helping probably to put Post-it notes with people's names in the cookbooks. Really looking forward to it.
And that's going to be like, what, your third year doing that?
My second. I couldn't go last year. I don't remember why. There was a conflict, but I did the year before. We both went into the city, and you did some archival research, and I went there. Yeah. This year I'm going by myself, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And then we want to tell you about 2 literary festivals that sadly, because of scheduling conflicts, I think we won't be able to make, but we wanted to let you know about them because they're great. The Newburyport Literary Festival in Newburyport, Mass., April 25th through 27th. This is free. They have poetry, nonfiction, fiction authors. There are a few Zoom virtual events, so we'll put a link in the show notes to their webpage. It's a really fun event and a really cool town to hang out in. They have events posted all over town. And then Booktopia 2025 at the Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont.
Yes.
May 2nd through 4th.
Yeah, so bummed I won't be able to make it this year.
Yeah.
That is where we met. We met through Booktopia and all those wonderful people. So check out the link in the show notes to see what authors will be there. I mean, and this is an event where people read the books beforehand and then get to have conversations with all of the authors. They have different time slots where you can, hopefully see all of the authors throughout those days and have fantastic conversations with the author and other readers who have actually read the book.
It's a really special weekend. They do have tiered ticket prices this year. So for $285, you can do the whole shebang, which includes dinners and the Yankee book swap and things like that. And then there's a ticket in a different price range where you just attend the book events themselves. And then they even have a one ticket price, I think it's $20, where you can just attend an event with Julia Alvarez with her book, The Cemetery of Untold Stories, which is a really great book. The lineup is fantastic. We'll put a link in the show notes so you can see it. And I did check, and there are still tickets available.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's a really welcoming community. So if you're a first timer or going alone, you'll be in good hands there.
Yes.
Yeah. And we just want to say too, we're not affiliated with any of these events or organizations. These are just things that are on our radar that we want to spread the word about.
And that we're mostly sad that we can't go to this year.
Yes.
So have fun, everyone, and report and send us pictures and all that stuff. Chris, do you have any upcoming reads?
Yes, I'm going to be diving into Old New York by Edith Wharton. This is a collection of 4 novellas. Each one is set in a different time period. So 1840, 50, 60, 70. Old New York. That's where Edith Wharton came from. She is a Jones originally. Edith Wharton's family, the Joneses, are the ones where the phrase was created, keeping up with the Joneses. They were very wealthy. And I can't wait to read these. I've read her novels. I've read her short stories, but never novellas, I don't think, from her. Although some people would say Ethan Frome and maybe Summer are novella length. Anyway, looking forward to some Old New York with Edith Wharton. How about you?
I have Blackwood's Blue Sky by Eowyn Ivey. I have it queued up, both the hardback book that just published recently and the audiobook. So I'm looking forward to digging into that. Eowyn's going to be a future guest. And then I also have, in both formats as well, Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. Charlotte Wood wrote The Weekend, which I really enjoyed reading last year, and this book is getting a lot of buzz and is now finally available stateside.
Nice. This episode is sponsored by
Fun, Essays on a Life Embraced by Eileen Weiler, a collection of humorous and hopeful stories relatable to Generation X readers. Full of wit and poignancy, Fun offers readers a front row seat to Weiler's world, be it performing stand-up comedy, prepping for a middle school swim test, or waxing poetic about discontinued bank pens. Observant and clever, Weiler's pieces are all heart as she spills tales about family and pays homage to pop culture. And in the Out Now category, these are books that we've talked about on previous episodes of the podcast, but they weren't published yet. Heartwood by Amity Gage and Swept Away by Beth O'Leary.
Okay, everybody, coming up next is our conversation with Ruth Franklin.
And I do want to shout out my neighbor across the way here who wrote a very good blog post about her top reads of the beginning of the year that happened to include The Many Lives of Anne Frank. We'll put a link in the show notes so you can read that blog post.
All right, everybody, we wish you lots of happy reading. We are so honored, excited, and a little nervous to welcome Ruth Franklin. Ruth is a writer and critic who teaches at Columbia University and the 92nd Street Y. Her writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, The New Republic, and other places, including her Substack, Ghost Stories. She's the author of 1,000 Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, and Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. Her most recent book is The Many Lives of Anne Frank, which is just out from Yale University Press. Welcome, Ruth.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be with you.
And why did we introduce you by saying we're a little nervous? That is not something we've ever said to a guest. There's some historical reason for that. When we were communicating with Ruth via email, we tempted her by saying that she's part of our origin story, the podcast's origin story. So it doesn't seem fair to have her on and not tell her what that is.
I really want to hear this.
And longtime listeners probably do know the story, but we're going to tell it again. Chris and I met because of a podcast called Books on the Nightstand, which is no longer in existence, but it was co-hosted by Ann Kingman and Michael Kindness, who at the time were book reps for Penguin Random House. And they were early in the podcast game and had a great podcast talking about books. And they started hosting these events called Booktopia. And the first ever Booktopia was at Northshire Books in Manchester, Vermont. And as the years progressed and they did Booktopias, they would do it in other places throughout the country around an independent bookstore. But every year they also did do it at Northshire. So in spring of 2015, Chris and I were both attending Booktopia. We didn't know it at the time. Chris had recently moved to Guilford, Connecticut as a transplant from Chicago. I was still living in Ohio, but planning to move to Guilford. And so mutual friends of ours said, oh, you two have to meet. You have to meet. And they'd point across the room and say, like, there's Chris or there's Emily. And we're both a little short. We never saw each other there. We never met, but we connected through social media. And when I then moved here in June of 2015, we met for coffee, started talking about books, and never stopped talking about books. At the time, Ann and Michael stopped doing Books on the Nightstand, so we didn't have a podcast to listen to, but we started to go on biblio adventures together.
Yeah, author events, cool historic libraries, things like that.
I think the first one we ever did was The Mount, Edith Wharton's house, The Mount in Lenox, Mass. So one day we were driving to the Northshire bookstore in Manchester, Vermont to see Ruth Franklin talk about Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life.
And we talked about books the whole way there, the whole 4-hour drive there. We talked about books while we were there. And then we talked about books practically the whole way home until Emily said, hey, what do you think about starting a podcast?
We didn't know anything about podcasting, but we were both missing Ann and Michael so much and having their voices in our ears. So we went home. Chris put on the voice recorder on her phone and we started a podcast. And that was in December of 2016. And we've been doing it ever since. Thanks to our gallivant to Northshire Bookstore to see you speak, Ruth. So thank you.
Wow, I absolutely love this story. I'm sorry that I didn't meet the two of you that day at Northshire Books. I would have loved to start the conversation then. But wow, I'm so honored to have given rise to this wonderful podcast. That's really great.
Yeah, totally. I mean, really chances are high it might not have happened without that drive. Thank you so much. And you did autograph the book for me. You did inscribe it, I should say. I don't know if you can see that.
Insist on your cup of stars. You must have told me that you were a fan of The Haunting of Hill House.
Yes, probably. I probably did.
Because, that is what I sometimes write to people who seem to have a special feeling for that novel, as, of course, I guess you know that I share that special feeling.
Yes, you do. Yeah, and this year, a few years ago, we started to have themes with our reading years, particularly with our read-alongs that we do with listeners. And this year, we decided to do ghost stories. And Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House was our first quarter read-along. And then we did companion reads of your biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. So we have a lot of listeners now that are fans of The Haunting of Hill House. Some of them, I think for Chris, it was like a third read. It was my first read, believe it or not. And some of our listeners' first reads, and some have read it before.
Fantastic. Yeah, I listened to your read-along episode to see what the reactions were. Of course, I'm always shocked when, not everybody absolutely loves that novel. But I was really, really interested.
Nice. And so what brought you to The Haunting of Hill House and then also to writing a biography of Jackson?
So I don't even remember the first time I read The Haunting of Hill House. I think I probably was a teenager. It's one of those books that has kind of always been in the background for me, as part of my life. It just really grabbed me. I've always loved haunted house stories, ghost stories in general, but especially haunted house stories, which can be so evocative and have so much to say about, especially about family life, the people who live in these houses and what happens to them. And, at the time when I was first thinking about that book, I had been writing book reviews for a while, mainly for the New Republic and for a few other publications. And I was getting a little bit frustrated with the book review as a form, just because, it forced you to put your thoughts kind of in this box of judgment. And there were so many times that I wanted to kind of range further. There were books that I didn't want to pass judgment on, but I wanted to be in dialogue with, or to be in dialogue with their authors, and to really get into what made this person create this particular work of literature at this particular moment in history, which is the question, that really animates my book about Shirley Jackson and my journalism about writers in general. It's the question that drives me. So as looking back, I realized that I was kind of a critic in search of a biography subject, or, a biographer waiting to blossom. And I had an earlier possibility that didn't work out, as things so often don't work out in biographies, because there's so many things you have to line up in order for everything to pan out. You need a subject you're really fascinated by, and there needs to be the material. And then, of course, usually there needs to be the cooperation of that person's estate. Mm-hmm. And at around the same time that I was thinking about all this, the Library of America brought out that anthology edited by Joyce Carol Oates of some of Shirley Jackson's foundational works. It includes The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, but it also includes a selection of short stories, most of which I hadn't read before, and a little bit of her autobiographical work. And that was what really hooked me. There's a passage from her story, The Third Baby's the Easiest, which, later gets incorporated into Life Among the Savages, where she describes going to the hospital to give birth to her third child. And the clerk asks her to state her profession, her name and her profession. And she says, writer. And he says, I'll just put down housewife. And when I read that story, I felt like it encapsulated so much about what it must have been like to be a woman like Shirley Jackson, living in the moment that she did, and just the challenges that she must have faced in carving out space for herself as a creative person, as a writer, with so many forces arrayed against her doing that. And that was really what propelled me into wanting to tell her story.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I really appreciated about that biography, is how you dismantled so many judgments around her and her life and her writing.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very frustrated with the way, with the way so many critics had tried to put her into a box. And in so do, whether it was horror novel or, lady writer or housewife or witch, whatever. There's so many possible boxes for her. And, none of them really allowed you to appreciate the full dimensions of who she was.
Yeah. And I also, as I read it, I didn't want to feel sorry for her. But there is a little bit of that. I wonder, it's a what if question that's kind of ridiculous, but what if she was alive now and she was getting paid what she was worth and she did have help with her kids? Would her career have been much different? It's a silly question, but I did think about that a lot as I was reading it.
Well, I mean, to be honest, one of the reasons I was so attracted to her story was because of the similarities between the circumstances of her life and my own. Even as a writer, then, working in the 2010s, I was a writer with young kids. And I felt a lot of the same kind of stresses and pressures that she felt at the time. I will tell you a funny story. When I was, first working on that book and reading, just setting out to gather the material, I checked out Raising Demons, her second household memoir, the sequel to Life Among the Savages. I checked it out from the library, and I had my two little kids in tow. They must have both been, 5 or under at that time. And when I brought it up to the desk, the clerk looked at the book, looked at me, looked at the kids, and said, totally deadpan, "Is it a how-to manual?"
That's great. I mean, I do feel like Shirley Jackson kind of had a sense of humor about that, about what she was writing at the time she was writing it. Even with, some of the things she was writing as like the appeal to housewife sort of articles she was writing, it was to make a living. But was some of it, do you feel like, kind of poking fun at the situation, or did she not have a sense of humor about herself?
I think it's totally poking fun at the situation. And, she did have a sense of humor. It comes out in so much of her writing, including in The Haunting of Hill House, which you talked about a little in your episode about it, how, Mrs. Montague, for instance, arrives at just the right moment to provide some necessary comic relief. Just as things are starting to get really tense and scary, she blows in there and for once, gives the characters all one focal point to unite against.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's funny in some of the
adaptation
that Miss Montague was quite funny in that one as well. Yeah.
Right. And even Mrs. Dudley is, kind of funny in her creepy way.
Yeah.
Yes. As I said in our Zoom conversation, I feel like I worked with Mrs. Dudley at a bed and breakfast one summer. She painted a very clear picture of that character.
One of the funniest things I think about Mrs. Dudley is that Jackson always, she makes sure to point out that she's a good cook. Yeah. Right, for all her other weird qualities.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful, right?
Yeah.
And so why did they hit it off, Mrs. Montague and Mrs. Dudley? Is it just because they have a common experience, maybe, in keeping house?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're two women of a certain age in a certain atmosphere. I think, I'd have to go back to look at the details, but her revision strategy wasn't to add, but to delete. Mm-hmm. And so from both Hill House and We've Always Lived in the Castle, there are tons of deleted scenes that she put in the original drafts and then took out, I think, to create the deep ambiguity that suffuses those novels. So much of their effect has to do with the reader, so often not really knowing what is intended or, what we're supposed to think about characters' motivations or sometimes even what exactly is going on in the plot. And so I feel like I remember there's a deleted scene between Mrs. Montague and Mrs. Dudley that kind of makes their connection a little bit more obvious.
Oh, interesting.
That makes sense. I know, because I always was like trying to picture where Mrs. Dudley lives. And then, maybe she and Mrs. Montague played bridge together or something, when she left the haunted house. Who knows? Wow.
Let's dive into the new book.
Yeah.
The Many Lives of Anne Frank, which...
before we do, can I just show you one thing that I think you will both look at?
Sure, please.
This little sampler that I keep behind my desk, which was made for me by a Shirley Jackson fan who I met on Instagram. And it has my absolute favorite Shirley Jackson quote on it, which is, "I'm a kind-hearted mama who studies evil all the time." I think maybe that is the perfect transition between Shirley Jackson and Anne Frank, because, what can I say? I am a kind-hearted mama who studies evil all the time, whether it's haunted houses or the Nazis.
Yeah. Yes.
That's what I'm up to here.
Yes, you've covered a lot of territory. And I think since we talked about your reading of The Haunting of Hill House, it felt right to us to step into this conversation about Anne Frank, talking about the first time you read The Diary of Anne Frank. And I thought we could just read a little bit from the book where you talk about your experience going to visit the annex or the Anne Frank house. Because I gasped when I read this. The experience of visiting these rooms can be profoundly emotional. Taking photos or video is prohibited. No screen can mediate between the visitors and the space. Many people comment on how much smaller it is than they expected. I first visited at age 8. After reading the diary for the first time, little as I was, I found it impossibly cramped. Returning 40 years later, now well into middle age, my body registered how rickety and steep the staircases were, set at such a narrow angle that I banged my knee while climbing up. You read it at age 8 and visited Anne Frank's house at age 8. Tell us about that.
That's right. Well, I feel like that tells you a little bit about the kind of family that I grew up in. But it was a family of survivors. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and I was introduced to a lot of Holocaust literature at, sort of a horrifyingly young age. And, like Shirley Jackson, it is something that was always there in my background, sort of in my family culture and in my intellectual makeup. It was absolutely formative. And so, I actually have this copy of the Diary of Anne Frank that my mother gave to me when I was 8, nicely inscribed with the date and the year and everything. And we used to go on family trips to Europe once every few years to visit my grandfather's family. My grandfather was one of 4 siblings who all unusually survived the Holocaust. And he had a brother who had settled in the Netherlands, as well as 2 siblings who had moved to Paris. And so, these family vacations to Europe sound very glamorous, but in fact, they were spent in the company of all these old people who had managed to kind of recreate their lives in Poland in these new countries and communities. So it felt kind of like going back in time. And in fact, I remember at one point visiting Paris with a boyfriend, much later, who was totally horrified to find out that I had never been out to eat in Paris because when I was traveling with my grandparents, we always ate at home. Mm. So that is the context in which I visited the Anne Frank house for the first time when I was 8 on one of these family trips to visit my grandfather's siblings in the Netherlands. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
In this new book of yours, The Many Lives, you really strip away all of the myths surrounding the diary to the point where I don't even know what to think about it at certain times right now. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. For instance, I didn't know that Anne Frank had edited her earlier diary entries and revised them, possibly changed dates of things, maybe made some things up. And you make the point that by her doing that, it's moved from being a diary to being a memoir to then almost, I don't know if you say almost being fiction in some regards.
I'm reluctant to go that far. And I certainly don't want anybody to get the idea that Anne Frank's diary is fictional. Of course, it has been targeted by Holocaust revisionists and deniers. There's a whole conspiracy theory about how it was written in ballpoint pen, which wasn't invented at the time of World War II. Anyway, it's all just, conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism. But what I do, indeed, I'm really, really interested in, as I said before, I'm interested in how books come to be created by this particular person at this particular time. And it's just fascinating to me that so much of Anne Frank's story is not better known, because the fact that she edited her own diary has been public knowledge for around 40 years at this point, in part because of these Holocaust deniers in response to, to claims that the diary was a forgery. The Netherlands Institute for War Documentation undertook this big forensic study in the 80s and published a big, what they call, critical edition of the diary that shows Anne's original draft, and then the revision that she herself did, and then finally her father's edits to it. It shows them all on the same page. So it's possible for the first time, starting in the late 80s when this book was published, it became possible for the first time for scholars to go over these different versions and understand what she had done. And I'll just explain briefly that we know why she did this revision, and it's because in March 1944, after the family had been in hiding for almost 2 years, she heard a minister from the Dutch government on the radio calling for citizens to preserve their documents of the war years for a future national archive. And that national archive is, in fact, the archive that I just referred to that undertook this investigation of Anne's diary. It became a very important site for researchers interested in the Holocaust in the Netherlands. So this man announces on the radio that they want citizens to preserve their personal documents of the war years, like letters and diaries. And Anne records this in her diary, and she says, everybody, all the annex residents, rush at me immediately. They all realized that they had a document just like the one that this government minister was calling for. But my sense is that it became clear to her because she didn't actually begin the revision. She doesn't write about beginning the revision until a couple months later. And I think it became clear that as she thought about her diary being read by a public audience and the purpose that it would have to serve as a Holocaust testimonial, rather than just, a chronicle of her life and thoughts as an adolescent girl, she realized that the way she had written it wouldn't quite work for that purpose. And so she had to go back to the beginning and rewrite a lot of it. And as you said, she adds some new entries that elaborate on the persecution of the Jews. And just about all of the stuff that she changed, especially in the early part of the diary, is intended, it has the effect of giving the diary a more testimonial and less personal focus.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm sorry I misspoke saying fiction. I meant to say something more like literary, because, I understand the horrific implications of using that terminology. But just so many other things about like Otto being accused of somehow censoring his daughter. I mean, that's the myth that I grew up with. I didn't even grow up with it. This is stuff that people were saying when I was in graduate school in the 90s. So I appreciate your book so much for bringing all of these other people in Anne's life to life and getting to see them as humans who not only just interacted with Anne, but then after liberation, and Otto is engaging with other people in, say, the American publishing industry, and just how lovely they all thought he was as a human being. So it was great to get that understanding of him as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I do really feel like Otto has gotten bad treatment in general from critics who have really been, very quick to judge him for, in most cases, the very minor edits that he made to the diary. There is this perception that he censored her, that he censored her criticisms of her mother, he censored her thoughts about her sexuality, especially, her possible bisexuality, which is often brought up. And the fact is just none of this is true. In some cases, these are things that Anne herself removed from her own edit to her diary. And in some cases, even things that Otto took pains to put back in. There are certain passages about her sexuality that were removed by the original Dutch publisher that Otto had put back into the English edition. So yeah, it's a very complicated story. I went into this with just a great deal of sympathy for Otto and respect for him. We started off by talking about my experience of reading the diary as a pretty young child, somebody who was younger than Anne. And I'll just say that, I'm sure most of your listeners probably have read the diary as teenagers or young women. And it is a really different experience to read it as a parent. And one of those kids who was the demons with me in the library was around 13 when I first started working on the Anne Frank book, which of course is the same age as Anne was when she starts her diary. And to see her from the perspective of a parent, and also, of course, to know Otto's history, that he was the only one of the 8 people in hiding in the annex who returned alive. He was the only one who survived the camps. And he spent about a month there after his return waiting and hoping that his daughters were going to come back. And then to have the confirmation of their deaths, and then to receive from Méprise, who was his former secretary and one of the very important helpers who sustained the residents while they were in hiding. After the raid on the annex, she and another of the helpers went up there to see if there was anything left to salvage, and they found Anne's diary and gathered up the papers and kept them in her desk, hoping that Anne would return. Then when it was confirmed that she had died, she gave those papers to Otto saying, "This is your daughter's legacy to you." And to learn about this as a parent, I'm sure you can appreciate how heartbreaking it is, and also just how incredible it is that in such a situation, Otto realized what an amazing book he had on his hands, and that it was a book with the power to change the world.
And I was amazed that he could get out of bed. I mean,
it's right there.
I was reading it and thinking like, wow, when you really, get the full experience that you give in this book about the the before of her experience being in the annex and writing the diary, and then Otto's experience of the after. And I thought, that probably one of the gifts of the diary was it gave him something to focus on so that he could get out of bed.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, he talked about being sort of possessed by the diary and his drive to bring it to light and have it find its readership.
Yeah.
Yes.
Speaking of readership, we wanted to ask you a question about, we recently read The Editor by Sarah Franklin that talks about Judith Jones, and you bring up Judith Jones in this book.
Yeah, so this was a biographer's choice question that we have for you because we noticed that you used her maiden name. And then also the same with Barbara Epstein. You use her maiden name, Zimmerman. And so we were just wondering about that. Is that your personal choice, or is that kind of a direction that biography is going in, to use women's maiden names when you're discussing them in a certain place and time?
I would say I think that is maybe a trend, is, when you're dealing with figures who are known by more than one name, to use the name that they were using when they're active in the text. And so for both of those women, that was the case. And you're right, it is maybe an unconventional choice, especially because both of them became so well known under their married names. Judith Jones is the amazing longtime editor of Julia Child and so many other great writers, who was the person who, in fact, discovered the Diary of Anne Frank in the slush pile when she was working in the Doubleday Paris bureau. She was given the French translation to reject on behalf of her boss. And in fact, she said later that something about the book just drew her in. Maybe it was the picture of the girl on the cover or what, she couldn't say, but she sat down and started reading it and was completely captivated, and managed to convince her boss that he ought to send the book on to the higher-ups at New York, who would make a decision about making an offer on it. And of course, her boss later took all the credit for that.
Yep. Gosh.
And then for Barbara Zimmerman, later Barbara Epstein, too, she was also a very young editor in the Doubleday New York office. It was actually her first job other than being a camp counselor. And it's clear, well, her daughter speculated to me that the reason they gave the book to her was because she was so inexperienced and they didn't expect anything of it. They gave this book a marketing budget. Maybe this is too, inside publishing, but they gave it a marketing budget of 0. They were not planning to advertise or promote the diary.
That's amazing.
It's not just that they got lucky, but that Barbara Zimmerman believed in this book and threw all of her intellectual weight behind it and to drum up a publicity campaign literally out of thin air. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so much to her credit that the book became the kind of household word that it did.
Yeah. Just that she got Eleanor Roosevelt to write an introduction.
Right, you're using quote marks.
Right.
She wrote the introduction that Eleanor Roosevelt signed. Yeah, right. It was just one of the things she managed to engineer for this book.
Yeah, I mean, that's so amazing. And it just, people talk about publishing today and the tricks and things that happen behind the scenes to publicize books, but it's just like, well, that's kind of always been happening. But did Eleanor Roosevelt read the diary?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I think so. She did later have a relationship with Otto Frank, who, by the way, was very surprised decades later to find out that she hadn't actually written that introduction. And it's I think, testimony to what a scrupulously honest person he was. That there's a letter from him in the correspondence with Doubleday where he says, by the way, I heard this rumor and I couldn't believe that Barbara would lie about such a thing. And the person who writes back says, well, it wasn't really a lie. This is something that sometimes happens, Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if she read the book or not, but I believe she was an initial supporter of the Anne Frank house when Otto was first developing the idea of making that building into a museum.
Excellent. Yeah. And I see nothing wrong with that. I mean, Barbara wrote something that she approved and maybe said I couldn't have said it better. So.
Right. I mean, when you think about all the people who say, well, I don't have time to read your book to blurb it, but if you want to write your own blurb and I'll sign it,
Yeah.
I was going to bring up blurbs, but I didn't. Thanks for doing it, Ruth. We also wanted to just ask a question about the structure of this book. It's got such an interesting structure, the way that you set up the different aspects of Anne's life, and then there are these interludes in between chapters. Can you talk about that?
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you appreciated that. It took me a long time to figure out the structure of this book. I knew from the beginning that I didn't want to write a conventionally structured biography of Anne the way I had for Shirley Jackson, which is basically chronological. It's structured around her books, but it's quote unquote cradle to grave biography. For so many obvious reasons, Anne Frank just wasn't a suitable candidate for that kind of conventional treatment, not least because everybody already knows her story and, how it ends. I felt like that gave me a lot of freedom to come up with something a little bit different. Then the question, of course, became, what was that going to be? And so I actually did research and took notes for this book for about 3 years before I figured out what I wanted the structure to look like. One day it came to me actually while I was standing in line at the airport. Suddenly I had this idea that I could structure the chapters around different identities that Anne had inhabited at different points in her life and afterlife. In the title, I call it The Many Lives, but identities is also a way to look at it, that she's a child when she's growing up in Frankfurt, and then she becomes a refugee in the Netherlands, and she's a target when the Nazis invade and start persecuting the Jews. And then I call her an artist when she's revising the diary, and she's a prisoner when she's first in the concentration camps. And then I call the chapter where she dies in Bergen-Belsen, I call it corpse. I deliberately chose that ugly word because I wanted to emphasize that that's what she was to the Nazis. She just was a body. She wasn't really a human being. And I chose it also because sometimes people criticize the diary or say that it's somehow not a real Holocaust story because it doesn't talk about the camps. It allows people to see Anne the way she was in life, beautiful and vivacious and intelligent and, articulate. And it doesn't force the reader to confront her ugly, ugly death. And so I guess I wanted to do whatever my part was in forcing the reader to fully process what had happened to her. And that's the first part of the book, which I call Anne Frank. And then the second part of the book is called Anne Frank in quotation marks. And that part is more of a cultural history of the idea of Anne Frank and sort of all the many different places that people have taken it from, from the publication of the diary through the Broadway and screen adaptations to, the many books. There's a chapter called Survivor, where I talk about the many works, mostly fiction, mostly novels, in which she appears counterhistorically as a surviving fictional character. And what it means, the secret is, of course, no spoiler here. When people write about Anne Frank in these terms, they're not really writing about Anne Frank. They're using her as a mirror for their own projections and preoccupations. And that's so true for the way she appears in any kind of discourse, especially the political discourse. And the last chapter of the book is called Pawn, which that discusses, her appearance in a few different ways in the political world. And at first I thought about calling that one something more positive as well, like activist. But I chose in the end to call it Pawn because I really did come to see that that's the way she's used and instrumentalized often when she's invoked in the name of political causes, many of which she had absolutely nothing to do with, in which her story isn't particularly instructive.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that after reading this, you realize she was not a political person. She didn't see herself that way. Who knows if she had survived? You mentioned that, and I've heard you talk about that. She could have become a political person, but she certainly wasn't as she was writing her diary.
That's right. And I think it's really important not to ascribe opinions or perspectives or whatever to her that she didn't actually support during her life. Critics and scholars have speculated with great confidence that an Anne who survived the camps would never have written the line that she really believed that people are really good at heart. And my own take on that is that we just don't know. We cannot ever say with any kind of certainty what a surviving Anne would have thought about anything, including whether people were good at heart or not, which in the book I have a somewhat different, counterintuitive interpretation of that line where I see it as really an act of resistance. It's an act of resistance to the Nazis to continue to affirm belief in the goodness of humanity.
Yeah.
Amazing book.
It is.
Yeah. And I love the way you so effortlessly weave in Anne's own words throughout the text and other people's. I just think it's brilliant. And I can't imagine the work behind that, how you were able to incorporate so much when you're explaining an aspect of her life or her time in the camps, to weave it like you did. Is that something you can talk about?
Well, thank you so much for saying that. It was important to me. You know, when I first started working on this project, the phrase popped into my mind that I wanted to write alongside Anne rather than over her. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea what I meant by that or what it was going to look like, but it just felt like an important principle that I needed to stick to while I was working on this. So what it ended up being was that, as you say, I incorporate lines from Anne's diary throughout the text in different contexts, not in quotation marks, but in italics. So they do stand out from the text a little bit in that way. And then I provide a lot of context and elaboration and, explanations of things, especially about the Holocaust in the Netherlands, things that Anne didn't know about at the time that she was writing, things that were going on around her, but that she didn't have the information about, but that nonetheless affected her life. I did that in a way that I hope adds a lot of dimension and nuance and complication to her story without replacing her own narrative at all. And in terms of, the chapters about her in the camps, of course, her diary ends a few days before the raid on the annex in early August 1944. She writes her last entry, I think, on August 1st. Then everybody's arrested and she doesn't have the opportunity to continue her narrative. So we know what we know about Anne's experiences in Westerbork, which is the transit camp for Dutch Jews, and then in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. We know about her experience in these places from the testimony of other people who saw her there, who knew her, became friendly with her, and remembered it later to talk about. So there are stories from these people. They're all women because, of course, the camps were segregated by gender. And to fill her story a little bit more, I read a lot of Holocaust testimonies by women, especially women who were in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, women of around the same age who were in those camps at around the same time, whose experience overlapped with hers in some way. And like Anne's diary, my book isn't fiction either. There are a few speculative moments, I would say, but there isn't any place in which I make up a scene that didn't happen or create dialogue that people didn't actually say or, add details that we don't know for sure exist in reality. But what I do is I try to create the world of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen as Anne might have experienced it, based on the testimonies of these other women whose experience overlap with hers. And what I'm saying here basically is, if something happened to many other women like Anne, we can imagine that it may also have happened to her. Mm-hmm. We don't know for sure, but this is part of her world. One of the big surprises, I'll say, about this research for me was how different in important ways the experience of women in these camps was from the experience of men. We know about Auschwitz from the testimonies of men, from Elie Wiesel's Night and Primo Levi's survival at Auschwitz. The testimonies we know are almost all by men. And what I found out was that women's experience was, in fact, different in some interesting and important ways. And for political reasons, even to this day, the question of whether gender played a role in Nazi persecution, it was taboo for a long time in Holocaust studies. Because the main point was that, of course, the Nazis persecuted all Jews because they were Jews. But it's not necessarily a corollary to that gender differences don't matter, because they do. Women were persecuted in some unique ways, including, of course, being constantly threatened with sexual violence in a way that, men didn't experience in a comparable way.
Yes.
Right. And being treated differently if they were pregnant, which is something a man can't experience.
Yeah. It's a very, very dark chapter in the story.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. I think we have 2 more questions.
Okay.
I think, but I'm not checking with you. So this isn't something we've talked about asking, Ruth, but just after what you just said, how did you manage doing this writing and then stepping into your life and being a mother and taking care of your family and yourself? It's tough subject matter.
It is tough subject matter. I think it helped. I'll bring it back to Shirley Jackson here, too. I think it helped her to have the structure of the family life. I'm sure a lot of the time she found it to be a big interruption to have to go take care of kids while she was in the middle of writing, just as I do. But I think it's also useful because it grounds us. It brings us back to the present day. You can really get lost in your thoughts and lost in this history. And this history is so dark. As much as I've read about the Holocaust, I was learning new things about it every single day while I was researching this book. And yeah, a lot of these stories, I think, can be really hard to bear. So when I'm working on something like this, I usually try to both write and research every day. So I'll start the day by doing 500 words or 750 words or something like that, so trying to move the text forward. And then in the afternoon, I'll do research and make notes and try to figure out where things are going. For each of my books, I have had these kind of long sprint sessions where my husband will take the kids away for a whole weekend or, a long weekend or something, or I'll be lucky to have a residency. And, there will be a finite period of time when I can just totally focus on writing. And I had a couple of those opportunities while I was writing this book, including a wonderful residency at the Dora Maar house, which is a house owned by Dora Maar, who is a mistress of Picasso, in this absolutely paradisical location in the south of France. It's maybe the most beautiful place I've ever been. Did I enjoy it? No. I sat in front of my computer and wrote for about 10 or 12 days. I wrote a mind-boggling number of words a day. And it started to affect my mind a little bit. In fact, I wrote a newsletter about it at one point where I speculate about whether the house was haunted, or this long, intensive stretch of focusing only on my work was starting to mess with my head a little bit because I was maybe seeing things that weren't there. And there's a moment in the book, actually, in the Anne Frank book, where I imagine an interaction with her, where I'm sitting at my desk and I have questions about the way that I'm writing at her. And as I describe it in the book, I look up and she's sitting across the room on the sofa. That was an experience I had at the Dora Maar house. Chalk it up to, I don't know what, the 100-degree heat there every day in August in the south of France, or the extremely long writing days in which I had this supernatural amount of focus, or the ghosts in the stones there, which, as Shirley Jackson's biographer, I'm not going to rule that out as a possibility. I'll just say, it's nice to have these stretches where you can churn out a whole bunch of words at a time, but I think it's healthier in the long run to have the balance between work and family life.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
Not one you often hear. Most writers are always searching for that long stretch, but it's a great point.
Yeah, it's good to have the long stretch, but I wouldn't want to do that all the time.
Yeah.
Now, your Substack is called Ghost Stories. Is that something you could talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I decided to call it that. I was transitioning. I had just been calling it sort of updates from the Shirley Jackson files while I was working on that book. I had a newsletter in which I put little things about the research and writing process. And then I was transitioning to Anne Frank, and I thought, well, I needed a name for this. And I had been speaking at a conference in Japan, actually, about Shirley Jackson and the domestic Gothic, and thinking a lot about haunted houses again. And I started thinking about biography itself as a kind of haunted house, and the biographer as haunted by the subject. And in that context, the stories that I'm telling are ghost stories, not just because I happen to write books about subjects who are dead. Of course, a lot of biographers don't. They write about living subjects. But because in writing a biography, you try to inhabit another person's mind. I try to put myself in the subject's perspective as much as possible. And for Shirley Jackson, that meant stuff like cooking from her recipe files, listening to the music that she talks about or watching movies that she mentioned. I bought a vintage bottle of her perfume off eBay so that I could try to access her. In that way, I felt like every little bit somehow could potentially contribute to understanding her better. For Anne, obviously, there weren't as many ways to access her. And for that, I relied very, very heavily on this original version of her diary, on the rough draft, as she had originally written it, as a way of trying to get as close as possible to her unmediated thoughts and perspective. And so, they're haunting me, but in a way, I'm also kind of haunting them. I guess it's a real sort of mind meld.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Fascinating. Yeah.
We'll put a link in the show notes to your Substack. We are both avid subscribers, and you're currently focusing on reading banned books.
That's right. Yeah. I have a new project that I'm not totally ready to talk about yet, but it does involve book banning in a way. And yeah, what can I say? I don't have to explain to you why this feels like a really important and central issue right now, including the Diary of Anne Frank is a banned book in some states. It's complicated. Sometimes it's focusing on the graphic adaptation of the diary, which includes this panel. Of course, it's in the regular version too, but the graphic adaptation includes a big panel that illustrates a passage in which Anne, in the annex, is remembering a sleepover with her best friend, in which, she's very curious about her own developing body and her friends, and she suggests that they touch each other's breasts. And her friend says no, and this is the extent of it. And this passage, especially as it's presented in this graphic adaptation, this passage has just been seized upon by these right-wing activists who are accusing the book of having LGBTQ content, as if that were a negative thing. But of course, it's the LGBTQ content that they seem to go after, more than anything else, I would say. I think with Anne Frank, there's also more than a hint of anti-Semitism there, that they've chosen her book to target on these grounds as well. So that was, what first got me really looking closely at these banned book lists and trying to understand what people are trying to achieve there.
Nice. Well, we look forward to following your project.
Yes, no pressure, but we'll be waiting and wondering. Ruth, thank you so much for writing these 2 books that we've had time to talk with you about, and for taking so much time out of your day to chat. We really appreciate it. And thank you for being the reason that we are a podcast.
I am speechless. I'm so grateful to you for your enthusiasm and your support of my work. You have no idea how much that means to me, really.
Thanks for listening to the Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.